So I am joined on the podcast today by Nevena Spirovska. Welcome.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
Very welcome. Thanks for making the time. We are going to talk broadly today about all things comms, but specifically within the public sector, and also kind of touching on God, I can't even say it. Advocacy. Why can't I say that? This is going to be an interesting episode if I can't even say the word. Before we get into that, do you want to give us a bit of an intro, Nevin, tell us a bit about your kind of career history to date, and then we'll kind of dive into some of the specifics from there.
Absolutely, Emma, and thanks for that. And yes, advocacy sometimes
Thank
tripped
you.
me up as
Easy
well.
for you to say.
I've said it far too many times. So, like many mid-age millennials now, I found myself finishing university not with much idea about what I wanted to do. I had no idea that communications was a career, let alone something that you could pursue in your life. So I picked up jobs here and there from when I left uni, and I found myself, very strangely enough, as someone who has no financial acumen, no financial will, and no financial interest working in the superannuation industry. So I was supporting a team there working across two funds based in both Victoria and Tasmania, working in a trustee space and just instinctively knowing that I was slightly out of place there. But I learned a little bit about superannuation along the way and eventually left that because I started volunteering with a political party. And lo and behold, like many opportunities that were coming across in my life, it would very much happen by accident, a very happy accident. And so, for any conservative ears, you may want to cover them now. I started volunteering with a political party called the Australian Sex Party. And so the Sex Party was set up in 2009 by Fiona Patten, and really it was taking a sensible look at civil liberties, things that adults were doing in their private times. So in 2009, it was a very different space politically and
Mm,
socially that we were now. We didn't have marriage equality. We didn't have medicinal cannabis. We didn't have some of those really common sense reforms that thankfully a politician like Fiona was able to push through in her terms of parliament. So Fiona was successfully elected in 2014, and I was really privileged to work alongside her as her campaign manager and also looking after the Sex Party's campaigns and communications. So I really started to develop a taste and flavour, understanding and love of campaigning, advocacy and comms. From there, I stepped into a slightly more serious space when Fiona was elected, working in her parliamentary and electorate office. So, this was a very high paced environment, which required a lot of understanding, not only of the enormous electorate that she was looking after, which was the Northern Metropolitan region, all the issues that were coming up. So, everything from duck hunting to, abortion rights, and the government business of the day. We had to be across it. We had to know what our message was, and we had to have the narrative. So that was really just such a incredible learning moment and experience to have to have that knowledge really start to be cemented in my mind, to understand what it meant to make connections with media, with
mm.
journalists, to understand that every different outlet needed a tailored message to accompany it. Sometimes you get it wrong, sometimes you get it really right. And so that really just helped me understand what it meant to be both in that responsive and reactive communicative space. From there, I was really lucky to have the opportunity to be a civil society delegate representing Australia at the United Nations. So that was at
Cool.
the 62nd conference on the status of women, which is a fancy way of saying women's rights all over the world. We have every country represented. And I was working in that policy sphere all the way in New York for a period of time and contributing to what would become the white paper that emerges from that. I really understood in that moment that campaigning and advocacy was the best place where I could funnel my skills, my passion, and my understanding and dedication. So I was lucky enough then to take on the role of campaign director for the homestretch reform. The homestretch reform was looking to increase the age of out of home care from 18 to 21. which is really sensible when you think about the fact that most people, myself included, really weren't ready to leave home at the age of 18. And yet just a few short years ago, young people who had been in out-of-home care, so that's usually removed from their families for many number of reasons, and then all support was cut off. So what this campaign was able to successfully do was change that legislation through our advocacy to be able to extend that and change the age from 18 to 21. At the same time, I was also working as a lecturer and producer.
Very little free time, I'm seeing here.
If you want something done, give it to a busy person, as they say.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was working at Victoria University, recognizing that this was a really interesting space to be in. They wanted to develop an activator, so really looking to do an entrepreneurial course for students with multilingual, multicultural backgrounds. So my co-producer and I were able to develop one that was specifically for Victoria University, made for the students, and we were able to create seed funding for some really amazing businesses that emerged from that activator to be able to have some funding there. From there, I took another slightly bizarre step for me because it wasn't somewhere that I had seen myself going. I went on to be the manager of public affairs and community engagement at the County Court of Victoria. This was at the time where the George Pell trial was just about to start. So it was one of the biggest moment in the county court. And we'll touch on that later, because when it comes to communications, crisis comms, reactive comms, responsive comms, there was no greater trial by fire than managing that with our team. I then moved back from whence I came, which was the not-for-profit sector, and where I've been for the last little while, alongside various different volunteer roles that I've had, working at the peak body for Child and Family Services, which is the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. There I look after strategic projects, communications and engagement. So really it's one of those 360 communications roles that encompasses communication with government, with our stakeholders, with our members and supporters. So creating broad-reaching multi-platform campaigns and communication strategies to really support the incredible work our organisation is doing. Along the way, I've also taken up some board roles, but really what my passion is very much cemented in the campaigns and advocacy space.
Wow. There's a lot. You did well to kind of condense that into a succinct kind of overview. There's so much there, and just as you're talking, like, so many questions kind of going around in my head. Interesting to hear you say at the beginning, and actually I think most people are the same way, in the sense that they come out of school or uni, and that first job you kind of just meant to know somehow, like, and I think few people are very, very lucky that they've had this kind of burning passion since they were very young, that they want to be or do X. But the vast majority of people don't have that. I know certainly I didn't either, and I think most of the people I speak to through this podcast didn't either. And it's often that kind of sometimes sort of trial and error at the beginning to kind of work out where you kind of do and don't see yourself. Your role there with Fiona, and I guess from someone who's never worked in public sector, never worked in the space, certainly never worked in politics, I can imagine as a marketer and from a comms and campaign perspective, that just must be fascinating. And how do you, I mean, there's just so much. I can't even, as I'm saying it, I can't kind of comprehend how you begin to corral all of that into comms and messaging. And tell me about that time. It just must have been, as you said, probably a trial by fire. But
it was. And I think the really interesting part, when you start to get a more thorough understanding of marketing and comms, is that so much is roughly applicable across multidisciplinary disciplinary areas. We're both tripping
It's
up today.
catching. Yeah.
It's catching, isn't it? But some of those rules really do stay the same. So in communication, specifically in the political sphere, you do find yourself that you're very much in the reactive space. So depending on what the narrative of the day is, depending on the relationships you have with certain journalists and media outlets, will really underscore how you can put that narrative forward. What we found, it was incredibly important to have the support not only of certain newspapers and media outlets that we were trying to get our story up in, but we also found that just because something seemed common sense to us, it didn't necessarily mean that the public support was there. Conversely, sometimes we found ourselves really surprised if there was a campaign that we thought, oh, maybe this is a little bit too much too soon. Things like medicinal cannabis, we were just overwhelmed with the response that we got. And we just found that tailoring the message, specifically when we're working in digital, the feedback was phenomenal. Just having a marijuana leaf is enough to garner a lot of attention. So we were really able to use A/B testing in those earlier days, about 6-7 years ago, to understand what the response might be and tailor those different messages to our audience across the electorate. So in that way, I think what the message that really came through to us is that just because our reform was popular doesn't mean it was going to get through. Just because we thought the reform wasn't going to get popular didn't mean it wasn't going to get through. So the framing was critical. If we said, legalize chuff as a more colloquial way, we wouldn't be able to get the support of, say, the Australian Medical Association, who were coming from a very different standpoint to us. So again, it was about creating issue salience, so keeping our issues in the media, keeping our issues seen online, keeping our issues seen by different eyeballs across the electorate, and making sure we were owning our communication, because in the world of politics, it's very competitive. And when you put a good idea forward, you'll often find that other voices very quickly start coming up. So it's either creating a coalition that you can create a strategic united message around, or really putting your ownership over a certain issue. So at the end of the day, when the vote comes around every 4 years in Victoria, people who want to keep you in Parliament will recognise that and take that second step, say in much the way a marketer would want someone to recognise their product and take the step of buying it on the shelf or online. We wanted people to take that second step and re-elect our party and Fiona for a second term.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And just as you were saying there at the beginning, I suppose, and as you said it's obvious, but I hadn't thought of it in that sense of it. They're still customers at the end of the day. It's just a different transaction. As you said, the principles are the same, and it's just about understanding your customer and understanding actually what they're ideally looking for, not making assumptions, and kind of working with data in that sense to be able to craft a message. You touched on before that sort of responsive and reactive. And again, my assumption would be that you could find yourself in that sphere being kind of pulled in the reactive direction more so than perhaps in other industries or spaces. Was that your experience?
It was. But I think when we were at our best, when we were being really clever, we were leading the media cycle. So we were setting the message. We were setting what we wanted media to be following. We were setting what we wanted the public to be following. That gave us an opportunity to control the narrative, because otherwise you really just are in that wash of being in the responsive space, in trying to always keep on top, but always being on the back foot because you can't quite know what the next question is going to be. When you're planning well, when you're really focused on what you're trying to achieve, and again, just flip it over. Instead of timelines, we have sitting weeks. We know when our sitting weeks are going to be. We know when the story needs to drop for maximum impact in Parliament. We know when we want to reach our supporters. We know which outlets to go to. So there is so much that is applicable across different disciplines. And when you are a communications all-rounder, when you're working 360, so many of us don't realize that that's what we're doing instinctively and all the time. But in the political space, there are a lot more surprises. And I guess in your day-to-day work, you don't have people actively trying to either change your message or undermine you. So it really does keep you sharp.
Did you find, I guess, instances where something would just, I'm sure, would just come out of the woodwork, and you would think that you've, been able to kind of craft a campaign or a set of comms, and we know this is what our customers are looking for from us, so we're going to go off down this path, and then something happens?
Yes, I think we
Sounds
all
so
have those
simple, doesn't it?
surprise
Something
moments.
happens.
Something does. Something happens. Something takes us by surprise, doesn't it? One really great example that came to mind is, so Fiona is very open about her background. So she was previously a sex worker. She's worked as a lobbyist for the adult industry for a long period of time. And a member of parliament took it upon himself to make an incredibly disparaging mark about her, full of stigma, just wanting to make her feel less than. And we were thrown by this because it was something that Fiona had spoke about in her first speech to Parliament, and she'd given interviews about it. But we were able to flip that and use a story that really drove the message home that she might have been the first person to become a prostitute and then go to Parliament, but many more people, potentially the person who had made that gentleman who made that comment, were visiting parlours themselves. So there was a lot of crossovers between the parlour and the Parliament. So much so in Melbourne, where we were based, there's a bar called Madame Brussels, and it had a telephone that would ring Madame Brussels, when it was a place where gentlemen might want to go after dark, so to speak, there was a telephone directly from Parliament to Madame Brussels. So the two are instinctively linked. And we were able to just take that moment and run with it and really push that narrative that, parlour to Parliament, all people are welcome in the parlour, all people are welcome in the Parliament. And our Parliament is much more richer when we have people with diverse lives and diverse work and life experiences working there. It did take us by surprise, but I'm really pleased how we were able to seize that moment, own the narrative, and then really use that as an opportunity to craft that message.
And I suppose on a simplistic level, that's the point, isn't it, of comms, to be able to cut through and to be able to kind of craft those sorts of messages that challenge people, that make them think in a different way, that take what they think they know, or probably what they actually don't know, what they assume to be correct, and actually challenge it and give them the opportunity to actually look at it and see whether what they think is actually right is right. I like that, though, from power to parliament. That's great. Very clever.
And that's framing, isn't it? We can frame communications and marketing in a certain way. We can talk about hospitals in a way that makes us feel sick. We can paint them in a really sterile environment. We can talk about how sick people feel or how genuinely upset. But if we look at it through another frame, we might be able to talk about how just as much of life comes into hospitals, talk about how where babies are born, where people go to be healed. So framing is the most important thing there. And just think about, if you're looking out a dirty window, often you're not seeing the full frame because you're going to have smudges on the window. But if you have a really clear frame, a really clear window, it gives you a better opportunity to shape how people view and see your message.
Yeah, it's a great point and a great analogy and a way to think of it. I really like that. You touched on before your time at the county court. Is that that's the correct name?
That's right.
Yeah. And that being during the George Pell trial, and just as we're talking about, responsive versus reactive, that's the example that kind of comes to mind. I would imagine there was just well, an unbelievable amount happening, but I would imagine being pulled in lots of different directions during that time.
It was. It was such a fascinating time, not only from a communications perspective, from public affairs, media management, and just in Victorian history to have what would be one of the biggest trials in Australia happening in our little city. So, like any communications plan, it took a lot of planning and care and, sometimes some luck. So, what underscored this trial was a thing called a suppression order. Effectively, it was just saying, media outlets, you can't talk about this because it's a live case and you might prejudice what jurors are thinking, because you can really shape that, can't you? If I was to say to you, oh, you don't want to meet that person in the next office, they're terrible, they're going to yell at you, they're awful, I've had the worst experience. It puts a certain image in your mind about how something might be. And in our increasingly connected and digital sphere, even when you don't have a telephone or you're not meant to be checking things online, there's still the temptation, I would imagine, when you're in such a high pressure environment. So the Pell trial was managed by my team and I in a very conservative environment. You can imagine working not only in the public sector, but in an organisation that is home to plenty of judges and really high profile cases like this. We had to take a lot of care and planning. And what underscored this was the relationships that we had to build up with journalists to create that sense of trust and understanding. So that included things like media briefs to know how the trial was progressing, to understand what was happening and provide that temperature check of, are we still okay? Is everything still happening? Do you still understand the reason for the suppression order? But keep in mind, this was happening in open court. So any member of the public, any journalist could come in and out and watch the proceedings of the day. They just couldn't report on it until the end of it. We were really lucky that we were able to successfully manage the duration of the trial. The trial actually went twice. So the first time the jury wasn't able to come to a decision. And so we had to run the entire trial again. Both times we were able to succeed it. We had listening software, much like people in marketing use, to have a sense and understanding of what was happening on Twitter, on Reddit, and other online forums, and to be able to track and see, because then, and what eventually did happen was we had a meeting with the Chief Judge, Peter Kidd, and we said, let's recognise that there's been such an intense media interest in this and public interest in the outcome of this trial. And so in an effort to promote transparency and really be an exemplar of open justice, meaning that anyone could know what was going on, we organised for the sentencing remarks, which is effectively the decision that the Chief Judge came to be broadcast live on television, to be broadcast on radio, and to also have the biggest courtroom at the county court open and an overflow courtroom where we had screens showing it happening. This particular trial touched so many people. And so we wanted to make sure that anyone who did want to be a part of that sentencing was able to. So even today, you can read the entire sentencing remarks online. You can watch it on YouTube. But we did find as soon as that decision came down, there was quite a bit of chaos, because there was overseas outlets reporting on the decision, and our friends in the Australian media feeling quite aggrieved that they weren't able to do the same. There was people online reporting on the decision itself, which led to the Director of Public Prosecutions having to take up a few warning letters. But it was just such a fascinating microcosm of crisis communications, reactive communications, responsive communications, and measuring the sentiment of the community simultaneously. One of a kind of experience, and I'm just, absolutely fascinated by everything that happened throughout it.
What perhaps I should have asked this at the beginning, but what's the I guess the overarching goal or kind of the principle behind the role in terms of comms and kind of public affairs? Is it to, I guess, build trust in the system and show that things are kind of happening as they are meant to be. How would you sort of describe the goal or sort of the overarching principle of it?
It's a really important connector role between the independent media and the court. So we know that most outlets have a dedicated court reporter or court reporters and need access to various parts of the trials that are happening at the county court. So not only is it a connector, not only does it provide and build up those relationships, but we were really able to take that moment of the chief judge wanting to engage publicly and create opportunities for him to speak on 3AW, on the ABC, and promote the knowledge and understanding of what the law is, what democracy means in the context of the law, and giving people, a bit more of an appreciation of just how difficult it is for a judge to come to a sentencing decision. Because at that time it was coloured by a number of different trials that the public sentiment didn't agree with at all. There was one regarding how an ambulance worker had been treated. At the same time, there was calls for mandatory sentencing, which is how American law works, in that if you commit a crime, there is just an automatic sentence that you receive no matter your circumstances. That's not what we have here in Victoria and Australia. And so the chief judge was able to speak to the reason why mandatory sentencing goes in the face of the rule of law and individualised justice, which tries to take every person on their face and every case as being completely unique as it is. So it's a really important role in that way of being the interface between both the court system, the community, the legal world, and the media world.
Did you know anything about the legal system before you started there? No, because I'd imagine it's the most unbelievably complex thing, and whilst you're trying to communicate that, I suspect on some level you're also trying to learn it yourself so that you can then disseminate that information.
It was a huge learning moment and journey for me. But as a communications and public affairs specialist in that role, my role wasn't necessarily to have a thorough understanding of the law. We had plenty of experts, and I was incredibly grateful for the knowledge sharing of my colleagues who had an enormous amount of legal expertise and legal knowledge. So it was there that I was able to build up a very, very, very basic understanding of osmosis, of cramming, but really the role sought to create that liaison point between the media and the court. So it didn't necessitate a large amount of legal knowledge, but it was good to pick up a few things while I was there.
So interesting, and such a unique experience and a unique environment, I'd imagine. Super interesting. I made a joke about it before when you were talking about your career history, but as well as these very interesting, large, complex roles that you were doing in your sort of quote unquote 9 to 5, you were also finding the time to take on additional, whether that's volunteer work, or you mentioned the opportunity to be involved with the UN. I would actually, I was going to make an assumption. I shouldn't make an assumption. I'll ask the question. Is that something at that point in your career that you were then kind of actively seeking out, knowing that was something that you were personally interested in?
I have been a long-term volunteer, again by accident. When I was between jobs, when I was a bit younger, there was a local organisation looking for people to walk dogs for elderly people who'd spent a lot of time in their homes and didn't have that opportunity to get out as much as they wanted to. And from there, I just realised that it's not that hard, and people tend to overcomplicate getting involved in volunteer organisations or just putting their hand up in their community where they can. And that can often create barriers to participation. So I wasn't necessarily seeking out any particular opportunities, but I did follow my passions. And so I was really interested at that time on animal welfare and social welfare and community building. So sought out opportunities. And that's really how I came to have some incredible people in my lives that led to amazing opportunities further down the track. But often people ask me, like, oh, I really want to get involved in volunteering, but I wouldn't know the first place to start. And so I break it down and I say, well, figure out what you're passionate about, find an organization that shares your values, and think about what you realistically would like to and can contribute. If you are a busy parent, it might not be the best time to put your hand up if you have home and work and family and other responsibilities. If you do have some time in your life, get in touch with a volunteer organization, but do so with kindness and patience. Most volunteer organizations are not even running on the smell of an oily rag. There is no rag. So it might take a couple of emails, it might take a couple of phone calls, but if you're patient, I guarantee you there will be incredible payoff at the end of it. So people who work in offices might want to try for something more practical or might want to volunteer the many skills that they have, but don't be too precious about it. I found myself flipping burgers, countless sausage sizzles, sometimes just handing out flyers. It's incredible what a difference that you can make when you just make that commitment to yourself and to that organization, whether it's 1 hour a month. Start slow, build up an understanding of what fits into your life, and you'll find that it blossoms and grows in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. Sometimes it's just not going to be for you, but I just think it's really great to give yourself the opportunity to be involved in different organizations and causes and feel that sense of community and contribution that you might have. The volunteer sector gives so much back to our community. So it's a beautiful thing, and just a really heartwarming thing to see yourself being part of that and seeing how interconnected that we all are. I feel that COVID, in the worst way possible, showed how interconnected we all are when services started shutting down and we were all in our homes. And the community is really taking that moment to build back. So, yeah, I say with unreserved enthusiasm, get involved, contribute where you can, start slow, go big, and all these opportunities you never knew existed will come to the fore and inform your life and really provide you with a perhaps defining sense of purpose that you can follow for many years to come.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because you mentioned the word purpose there, and it's certainly post-COVID has come up more and more when I speak to people. Perhaps if I'm having an initial chat with someone who's starting to think about the next step in their career, I'm trying to think of a sort of a percentage number to put on it, and I can't come up with it off the top of my head, but significantly more people than were doing so before have started asking about for purpose. And I think it's one of those things. I mean, for purpose, it's a broad statement, and I think one of the things I often say to people in those conversations is to, in a nice way, slightly challenge them about what they mean by that and what that could actually look like in their lives. It may be absolutely, for someone it's a not-for-profit organization, for someone else it might be a for-profit organization, but perhaps something that's member-based that really resonates with their sense of community. In other instances, I think it might actually not be about what the organization itself does. It might be about what you do in support of your team and how you can mentor and coach and grow a team. I mean, that's a huge sense of purpose in someone's life, but a different definition of it. And I think, again, what you were saying there about volunteering, and I think, again, I hear a lot of people say, oh, I want a for-purpose role, and then they don't end up with one. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in that one aspect of your life. Just, your 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, whatever it is, work life might not be the place where you are lucky enough to find purpose. It may be in a completely different area of your life. And if you have some time, it might not be a huge amount of time, but some time, maybe that's where you can find that avenue that that kind of fulfills that more community minded, purpose driven part of all of us, I think. And interesting you mentioned COVID there, because I do think that's one of the things, as you said, that we lost through COVID, was just that sense of connection as people. And I think that's why a lot of people then came and said, I want a for-purpose role. I think that's what they were looking for. But yeah, volunteering is definitely an avenue to explore that. The other thing we touched on at the beginning, which is the word I now can't say, advocacy, almost nearly.
Advocacy.
Tell me how that's become a part of your life, and a part of some of your roles and not roles, and volunteering and all of the above.
I love advocacy, and this is just something that really drives me. So I've been volunteering with an organization called the Victorian Pride Lobby, which is an LGBTIQA plus advocacy organization, and a few other different campaigns and projects along the way. Advocacy is really just about trying to drive a purpose. So you might want to change legislation because you want a more equal society. You might want an extra light in your parking lot because you can't quite feel that sense of safety if you're in a dark parking lot in your local area when you're dropping your kids off at sport. So it's really about creating some kind of change. Advocacy and communication are intrinsically linked. So all advocacy is communications, but not all comms is advocacy. And what I mean by that is to really be strategic communications, we need to have deliberately crafted means to an end. So it's almost like a formula that works there. We want comms that are strategic for people to use words and actions and images and symbols to influence the attitudes and opinions of the persons whose mind we're trying to change. So if we put it in a marketing point of view, it could be that we're trying to advocate to our customer to come to our product because we know we can solve X for them. From a communications point of view, we might want to change someone's framing or opinion or understanding of a particular community. When I think about how we communicate and advocate to culturally and linguistically diverse communities or LGBTIQ communities, advocacy is a way of creating positive social change using communications. There are many different roles that now take in advocacy, and you'll find often young people are really drawn to it because they want to be promoting action. They want to be involved in change. And so when we think about how we can weave that into our work lives, into our volunteer lives, even into our personal lives, think about how we advocate for ourselves when we're perhaps on the phone getting a little bit frustrated with a provider about why they can't see our point of view. So it's a great thing to learn more about, because the better that we can advocate in those different areas of our lives, we're going to see better results. So whether it's with a dollar outcome, whether it's, to finally get that light in the parking lot, or whether it is that sense of achievement we feel being able to amend legislation, it's communications with purpose and drive. So I've really enjoyed everything that we've done in that space. It can be overcooked a little bit. People, can get out these big formulas and theories of change. There is, things that underscore good advocacy, but really, if you have passion, you're willing to learn, there's all kinds of things that you can do in your work life, in your local community, that can create some really special outcomes.
What advice would you give to someone who, I don't know, comes along and says, hey, I want to be an advocate. I feel really passionately about X, Y, and Z, whatever it might be. I want to be an advocate in this space. What would you advise? What path should they take?
The first path would be to affirm their passion. And then the second would be, now let's Google it, because if you're feeling that passion, no doubt other people are feeling that passion too. So we are so much stronger when we advocate together. See if there's an organization, a campaign, or a project already in the space than what you're doing. one of the biggest shames, I think, in the for-purpose, not-for-profit and volunteer sector is the sheer amount of duplication that happens. Last time I checked was a couple of years ago, but there was something like 56,000 registered charitable organisations in Australia. 56,000.
Huge.
And
Yeah.
think huge, enormous amount of infrastructure that exists there. But then think about how every organisation needs different resources. So you need a comms person there. You need someone who understands the books. You need someone who roughly knows what the purpose of the organisation is. And there is just so much waste and duplication that happens there. If you can join and create an alliance with, if you can contribute to an existing cause or organisation, you're going to save yourself so much trouble. But we do find, well, it is my experience sometimes that people want to be the what's called the entrepreneur syndrome. They want to be the standout. They want to be the person that's created world peace or solved the crisis. No one person can go at it alone. Our efforts will be much better felt when we can combine with other people's, rather than having to waste time, doing mountains of paperwork just to get registered with the ACNC, which is the organisation that governs charities in Australia. So really, respect your time, respect your cause's time, and the best piece of advice, find someone else or some other people or another organisation that shares your passion and contribute to that.
Just something you touched on earlier, and I guess in terms of being an advocate, and I'm going to say it that way now because I can say that without stumbling over it. In terms of being an advocate, I guess just in sort of everyday life on things that you feel passionate about, I think there's and I don't know again if it's something that's kind of come off the back of COVID and lockdown, or whether I just want to blame everything on that, but I think sometimes I think we've lost a little bit of the people feeling comfortable to speak up or to say, I believe this, or I don't agree with what you've just said, and whatever it might be. I think even that just very simple sort of day-to-day approach of having those types of conversations with people that you come into contact with, in obviously a polite, respectful, sharing of ideas and communication. But I think sometimes, and maybe it is that entrepreneurial example, people might gravitate to the big shiny way of doing it, but there's also a very everyday sort of way of doing it, and maybe there's a time and a place for both, but maybe it doesn't always have to be some big shiny thing. It can actually be talking to the people who are in your life about a particular issue, and trying to influence and advocate in that way.
I completely agree. And I think exactly as you said, Emma, as long as it's underscored by respect and understanding, if you're willing to keep your mind open to other people's points of view equally as much as you'd like their mind to be open to yours, we can get to a greater understanding about the very strange predicament that we find ourselves in 2023, where people are hyper siloed, where we are increasingly introduced to more extreme points of views. If we lead with respect, if we approach our communications and our understanding with respect, we're far more likely to have an impact on ourselves and the people around us than if we charge through life just expecting people to understand where we're coming from, or worse yet, judge them for not being able to read our minds.
You made me think, as you were saying that, about some of the people who are in charge of socials these days, and you just see this, just pile on in whatever direction it is, and you just think, how are you meant to unravel that as a social media manager? Or maybe even it might even become a broader comms issue because it's become a crisis because something's happened online, and it's just it's kind of scary, actually, just the what's the word I'm searching for? Just the extremes which have kind of come about. And, you know, maybe it's a slightly simplistic idea and I'm naive for thinking it, but just this idea that we could just all have a conversation about it and share our ideas. And as you said, try and understand the other person and try to kind of talk through it, as opposed to immediately both, you know, go to extreme corners and then try and, you know, wrestle it out. It's yeah, as you said, it's a strange time in 2023, and I think that's a lot of the reason for it. It's the extreme reactions.
Yeah. And I really feel, and I think it's an important conversation that we're going to have in the communication space. How do we guarantee the safety, the work safety rather, of people who work in social media management and who are exposed to these levels of vitriol and hate and abuse day after day, scrolling through these comments, having to interface with that? You know, what is the reasonable response that you're trying to get when you're typing all, you know, manner of really vicious things? Someone has to read that, someone has to see it. Oftentimes they shouldn't have to respond to it, but they do. So it's a let's say, a charitable way of saying it's an interesting time in communications.
I agree. Yeah, and a really good point of, yeah, someone somewhere is in charge of trying to respond. I mean, not that I think some of it even warrants a response, but someone somewhere is having to engage with it in some form or another, and I'm sure it's taking a huge a huge toll on them to do that. We've covered a lot of ground there, and some, as I said, super interesting topics. I'm going to end though with the same question that we always end with here on the podcast, and that is, what do you know now that you wish you knew then?
I wish I could take a little bit of a time machine and just drop this little nugget on my head, you know, 20 odd years ago. And that's, consciously or not, communication is a central and essential component of any role that you have. So our emails, how we speak to others, how we manage our stakeholders, our managers, our teams, that's all communication. And the more effective that you can be in communicating, no matter what your profession, the more efficient and successful you will be in your role.
I love that. That's a great answer. I'm going to ask something else that just sprung to mind as you were saying that, because I completely agree with what you've just said. Given the importance of communication, how do you personally kind of fold, or do you think will fold AI into that? How's that going to work?
It will really depend on how every organization chooses to integrate it. It is inevitable. So whether we integrate it into a shortcut way of how we use text and how we use copy, nothing will beat the knowledge and understanding of a person who understands your product, your organization, or your purpose. It might just be quite a simpler way for us to be able to integrate different components into our many different avenues of communications. It's here to stay. The more that we can understand it, the more that we have frank conversations within our organization about what our risk tolerance for different areas of AI is going to be, the more on the front foot that we can be. Anyone who says, oh no, there's no way, or it's going to take on too much of our work, I think we just have to be realistic. Some people are going to use it a lot more, but even if you just put in information now, it's pretty dodgy. So nothing will beat a human, but most importantly, we really have to understand what these robots are going to be able to do for us.
That's a good place to stop. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and really appreciate you talking about your experience and kind of what you've learned along the way. It's been great. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. I appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome.